Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural presentation of the Renee and Lester Crown Speaker Series. I am Sarah Mangelsdorf, Dean of the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences. This lecture series is made possible through a generous gift from friends of Renee and Lester Crown in their honor. The intention of the series is to bring to Northwestern outstanding scholars and speakers from around the world who have conducted research on and written about various dimensions of Jewish civilization. I don't have to tell you that the Crown Family Center for Jewish Studies, host of this evening's event, has benefited greatly over the years from the generosity of the Crown family and its commitment to Jewish scholarship. The Crown's involvement with Northwestern dates back to the 1940s, when Lester Crown earned a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Northwestern's McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science. He has since become a well-known industrialist, philanthropist, and a longtime member of Northwestern's Board of Trustees. We are so very fortunate to have Lester, his wife Renee, and the Crown family as part of our Northwestern community. We are thrilled to have them with us tonight. Please join me in it. And tonight, I'm especially pleased to announce that the Crown's generosity and commitment continues through a new significant gift that will be used to expand undergraduate teaching on modern Israel and support activities related to the understanding of Israeli culture, politics, and society. This gift will also found a new academic position, the Crown Chair in Israeli Studies. In recognition of the center's new scope, the Crown Family Center for Jewish Studies will be renamed the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. This new multidisciplinary center will expand Israeli studies covering the period 1948 to the present and will examine the background leading up to the establishment of the modern Israeli state. Courses on Israeli studies will be offered throughout Weinberg College within the departments of history, political science, sociology, anthropology, economics, comparative literature, and various language and literature departments. Please join me on behalf of the college and the university in thanking Renee and Lester Crown for their continued commitment to Northwestern University and the friendship they have shown us over the years. This time, it's my great pleasure to introduce Barry Limpheimer, Director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies, who will introduce this evening's speaker.
Thank you, Sarah, for your introductory words. I'd like to acknowledge President Shapiro, Renee and Lester Crown, and the group of friends led by Jerry and Barbara Perlman, who banded together to make this present to the Crowns, which we all get to enjoy tonight, so thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge two people who were very instrumental to tonight's gathering. My predecessor in this position, Yochanan Petrovsky-Stern, worked with Jerry Perlman to put this together, so thank you, Yochanan. And our program assistant, Nancy Gelman, who's around somewhere, has worked tirelessly on tonight's event and really worked very hard to pull this together. Thank you, Nancy. In 1999, Nathan Englander's For the Relief of Unbearable Urges was published to considerable fanfare, especially in New York, where I was living, and particularly in my Jewish corner of New York. I must confess, though, that I did not run out to get it. As I remember it, much of the media attention focused on the title track of this collection of short stories, a story about a traditionally observant Jewish man who finds his way to Tel Aviv's red light district, and framed Englander as we say in Yiddish, an enfant terrible, who was raised with an Orthodox background but was now avowedly antagonistic to organized religion. For this coverage, I figured on a set of stories told by a cultural insider that thinly fictionalized his own experiences and observations as part of a knowing critique with a little bit of a wink on the side. I had read enough of that kind of fiction already. Perhaps a few months later, I was a weekend guest in someone's house and in desperate hunger for a book. Who but a Jew would hunger for a book? Scanning the shelves, I found For the Relief of Unbearable Urges, a book already in the process of being canonized in the domestic Jewish bookcase, alongside the Bible, the Talmud, and Irving Howe's World of Our Fathers. And I finally gave in and read it. The book was not what I expected from the media coverage. While that coverage focused heavily on the personal biography of the writer, it didn't properly attend or do justice to the book's content. What impressed me about For the Relief of Unbearable Urges, and has continued to impress me in Nathan Englander's writings, is its relationship both with the Jewish tradition and, more importantly, with actual Jews. All people have a tradition. As individuals, we are introduced to the cultural world through a set of inherited meanings that frame the way we understand, even the way we see people, places, and things. This is a hard thing for creative writers to accept, since it means that the unique and individual creativity that they must cultivate is ultimately limited. For writers associated with their ethnicity, this can be even more problematic, as they are faced with the possibility of forever being labeled by their cultural patrimony. Great writers like Nathan Englander do not just accept but embrace their inherited tradition. They recognize the ways in which unique ethnic realities can be props that stage the human condition, and that the limitations of specificity are opportunities for creating authentically human portraits. Nathan Englander's stories are not thinly fictionalized slices of his own background. They embrace Judaism in order to describe the humanity of Jews, whether those Jews are wig makers, Holocaust survivors, or pot-smoking Hasidim. The characters are empathized with and appreciated, not caricatured or ideologically critiqued. Englander's work is informed by the Jewish tradition, not so much because his characters know gefilte fish from a knedel, but because, like so many Yiddish and Hebrew writers before him, Englander writes the world he knows, which happens to be a traditional one. And like the great Yiddish writers before him, Englander is able to produce imaginative, even fantastical fiction that feels authentic because it is familiar, continuing a line of creative Jewish storytelling that began with the Bible and has never stopped. On behalf of Northwestern and the Crown Family Center for Jewish Studies, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Nathan Englander. Thank you.
It's a great honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to meeting a lot of folks. I know I'm having a nice dinner after. But I already had the wonderful opportunity this afternoon to talk to some of your brilliant students who were honestly just warm and open and brilliant. And I'm going to start my speech differently because I'm sort of in mid-thought from the conversation that we started in that classroom. And to back you up, as I thought they'd ask the usual, pen and paper questions or history questions, but sort of it was more, not even just like, this general notion of like, what do you write about or subject matter or writing process. It was, we sort of got into what happens when you write, and I think actually maybe that's a good place to start because it really does feed into the larger notion of why I write what I write. So this is where if I was a real kind of professor, we'd drop a whiteboard or something so I could start doing three-dimensional brain models. But I am going to spend like 2 minutes explaining that kind of process because I didn't really get to in that classroom and they were so nice to ask about it. But yeah, in the middle, the very last story in this book that I wrote, especially if we're talking about Israel studies, that's in my head as well, is a story called Sister Hills, where, stories have many different kinds of genesis, but this one, sometimes you hear the last line, sometimes you hear characters talking, sometimes it's, these things pop into one's head or my head. But I thought in this very intractable situation that we're seeing again, having lived in Jerusalem, I see friends from the Holy Land out here. When, the years that I lived there, it's very clear also that you can just have peace tomorrow. Both these things are unsolvable and they are utterly obvious solvable. And if anybody would ask me, like anyone who's lived in Israel, I will give you all the answers. I can draw you a map right now. It'll be very fair. Everyone will be very happy with my final plan for the state. But I thought there's just an infinite number of articles and stories and just endless, the whole A1 section of the Times is just, what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Israel. And I thought, what about writing the whole history of the settlement movement, the whole history of this conflict in one short story? That would be good. I bet, to compress this idea. And it's a story called Sister Hills, which sort of explores the, moral, legal ideas behind, what it is to, occupy and be occupied, what it is to, sort of take ownership of territory in this world, to take ownership of anything. But what I was talking to the students about was the fact that it's really a strange process with writing that one can ever figure anything out. By virtue of the fact that I make everything up, that I write every detail, that I construct the whole world, it is not possible for me to figure anything out ever. That is, I should have all knowing at the time. So if I'm sitting there on a Friday, how could I possibly know something on Monday? Like, why stay at your desk? how am I ever supposed to know anything more if I've made it all up? I should just have all the facts, which leads me to the idea that there must be something going on, that there is a kind of second consciousness, that when one is writing, it is truly, creativity is a kind of subconscious meeting conscious act. So the way I explain this is that I was sitting there suffering with the end of this story, and I just could not figure it out, as I said, which is impossible because I made it up. I should just know. But I'm sitting there in these 12-hour days. I can Sitzfleisch. I can sit a long time at this point. So I'm sitting there, Saturday, I remember Sunday, Monday, and it's literally a 12-hour day, and I just sit there. And for those of you who write or do any kind of creative process, as you know, there's a way where you can engage with text and work. I know we have academics in here, and you fix things and you work all the way up to the point where you truly need to engage and move forward, and then you eat a Pop-Tart. You know what I'm saying? Then you make a phone call, then you refresh Gawker or send an email. This is the way that we don't have that emotional engagement. Well, my point is, there I was. I do what I do at these specific times. I called a couple of friends to complain, and it's like 9 at night, and I'm sitting there, and I'm sitting at my desk, and suddenly I look down and I see that I'm typing the rest of this story. Like, the caps lock are on, I'm typing as fast as I can, and it's just, I'm not even finishing sentences, just fragments of description, of dialogue, of scene. It's just all coming out, not even time to take the caps lock off. And I'm sitting there looking down, and I'm typing as fast, I'm literally figuring out that map did become the map with which I wrote the rest of the story. For the next 3 weeks, I was completing the story, and I'm looking down and I'm thinking, stay calm. Like, don't move, just stay, you're writing, something's happening here, like, just don't knock yourself out of it, just stay in it, it's happening, like, just don't really, my point is that it reminds me, in a sense, of that feeling, which is, if you want to know, for the parents of some of these students, why your children are bad, I think it's this idea of this betrayal that's built in the childhood thing when you learn how to ride a bicycle. I just remember this feeling where, that's how I learned how to ride a bike. The training wheels come off, you're running down the hill, your mother or father says, I've got you, I won't let go, and you find out you can ride a bike because you turn around and nobody's there and everybody's clapping. And that's when you hit a tree or go up a telephone pole. I went up the telephone pole or get gravel in your knee. And to me, again, it's just such an idea that's education to me. It's the most shocking parental betrayal ever. The whole, much more important than learning to ride a bike is understanding if your parent says, I got you, that they're not letting go. To me, I would really rather we don't ride and understand that bond won't be broken. But nonetheless, creatively, it's that same kind of feeling where as soon as you know you're riding the bike, you crash the bike, and that's almost the same feeling when one is in that creative state. But why I bring up that as an example is because that was the moment at, last year at, 40 or 41 years old where I sort of got a better understanding of the writing process. Because if I'm sitting there, me that's talking to you, looking at myself saying, don't interrupt, stay calm. If you think it's like that bicycle thing, you're going to fall off and you're going to stop writing, who's writing? You know what I'm saying? If my conscious self is watching, who is, like, my hands are moving, who is telling the story? If the self that is talking to you is wholly engaged, my current intellectual conscious engagement was in not interrupting whoever is typing, which is also me. So the point is, it really is what it is, if we're talking about things Jewish, to me it really goes back to the whole thing of how religion works, how sports work, how any kind of training for heightened states work. This is what yogis do. I actually got the answer to this, soon after, where I was doing an event. There's this lovely Rubin Museum in New York, and they do these wonderful pairings where they'll have a psychiatrist who specializes in pleasure centers and Jacques Torres on chocolate. You know what I'm saying? They do these wonderful pairings, and they paired me with a neuroscientist to talk about dreams. Like, this very big neuroscientist has flown in from McGill, and we were going to talk about my dreams. That was the bill. But I learned this from my best friend, Melissa, who's been my best friend since we're 4. Whenever I try to tell her a dream since we're 4, she goes, nobody wants to hear your dreams. That was really helpful to me, so I understood that this was a lovely idea for an event, but nobody wants to hear your dreams for 90 minutes, or it was it was a long one. So anyway, but I said, let's talk about what happens when I write. What about the waking dream? And the point is, talking to another writer about writing process is a horrible, terrible error, because it's like talking to another alcoholic about your alcoholism. So if I'm like, I drink 2 cases of beer a day, is that a lot? And you drink 3, and you're like, doesn't sound so bad to me. It's not. You're talking about someone who indulges in the same extreme way. But talking to a man of science is a very separate matter, and it was unbelievably wonderful. I said, this thing just happened to me, so what is happening? Like, am I mad? Like, what could possibly be happening when I'm watching myself type? And he said, which is, again, really what we're getting to the heart of matter of how a book gets written, how intimate it is he said, simply without pause, he goes, oh, it's a disassociative state. He said, simple. Like, we all daydream. Everybody, we think we're conscious all the time. We're not conscious all the time. We just are not conscious of being unconscious, so our experiences of being conscious all the time. But at some point in the day, you hear a bird, you look out the window, you see something, and this idea, we all at some point daydream. Every one of us does it. But this idea of sitting in a certain space, this idea, again, with prayer, with meditation, what you're training your brain to is to engage with these dissociative states. So what a writer, he said simply, he goes, oh, it's classic, and yogis do it, and he did that whole list, and he said it takes a long time to get into that state, hence the pacing and the Pop-Tarts, and then you can only keep it in short bursts. But simply what a writer does is he or she has trained his or herself, like, I can be in this unconscious state, but my fingers are trained to type at the same time. That's the engagement. That's how a book gets written. That's what I was talking to your students about. But subject matter, immediately, how this specific book that I'm talking about, my collection from this year, what we talk about when we talk about Anne Frank, well, to get to that state, as you can imagine, kooky as it sounds, one would have to be comfortable with oneself. And I think that's the biggest part. I can't say it enough times that writing is the easiest thing in the world. It's the most joyous thing in the world. It's just utterly freeing, utterly exhilarating. That's the best, really, one of the most joyous, special moments is to be engaged or disengaged in that way. But the hard part, the 99.9%, it's not, perspiration, forget that saying, but it literally is about emotional engagement, about being comfortable with oneself. And I think for me, as was said in the very generous introduction, is it's very strange. One dreams of being a writer. It's all I ever dreamed of. First I feel like those are the stages. One dreams of potential and then opportunity, but then one needs to learn to be a public figure and live outside and interact with that way, and thank you all for coming out tonight and for being here, but that's the point. This is an interaction. We are, sharing a space and sharing our consciousness. And, last night, again, I've been working on a play for years, which I can tell you about or not, but last night's opening, night, and it's this idea where you put stuff out into the world, and then one also has to learn to live as one is in the experience of everything coming back at you. So at a very young age, which seems to be younger and younger every year I get older. But, when my first book came out, I was suddenly a Jewish writer, and that was news to me, in a sense. And that was, it was a wonderful thing, and I love the support. One writes a book, I can talk about my Argentina novel for a second, but that book, that took me a decade to write. It's got a zillion things woven into it specifically for the Jewish reader, and I appreciate that support. It has a million things woven in for the Argentine reader. That's a whole separate thing. And then it has things woven for the close reader. Like, one connects with specific audiences by subject matter, obviously. Like, I love the support of the Jewish community, and I understand that all my stuff, the subjects are Jewish, the characters are Jewish, the food is Jewish, the ideas are Jewish. I get all that. But the idea is I never identify as a Jewish writer. And it was suddenly alarming for me to suddenly supposed to be both from the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community, a Jewish writer. And it took me probably, the better part of, a few years to, suddenly, understand what that meant, what my resistance of it was. Very confusing to other people and to me to be resistant to this idea of being a Jewish writer. And then I finally understood is that, and this idea must be cooking because I talk about it all the time, but, I'm an American, my parents are American, my grandparents are American, two of my great-grandparents were born in this country, it's my great-greats that came over. This idea that because I'm Jewish, this is the whole idea of this country. If I talk about this travel, I could live in Holland forever. I'm never going to be Dutch. I'm going to be an American living in Holland. If I move to Germany, they're not going to make me German. These cultures, a lot of cultures don't allow for it. The beautiful thing about our country is one can become an American, and it's very interesting to me in literature that that's somehow harder to do. Like, I grew up in a world that was only Jews solely. That's all it was, and only religious Jews. We didn't even acknowledge secular Jews. We didn't really consider Jews. Like this idea, to live in a closed world does not mean it's not a complete world. You know what I'm saying? I grew up in a whole universe that was only Jews and only Jews like me. And then when I started to get interested in broader ideas and wanted more adventure, I went to state school in New York. So my adventure is that I left my sort of Jewish shtetl on Long Island and went to university and met Jews from other parts of Long Island. You know what I'm saying? That was my broadening, but that wasn't enough for me. I really wanted to, learn about the planet and see the world and understand geopolitics. So I went to Israel, where I met Jews from other countries. You know what I'm saying? And then I, moved back to New York to live in Manhattan, to be in the big city, which has no shortage of Jews. So, but this idea that I'm supposed to, it over time became clear to me what the resistance was, which is everybody's welcome. We all make order. I remember this from my first book tour. It was the first time I really saw America, was flying around to understand that the whole country is cut into squares. It still makes me dizzy to look out a plane window and see it's utterly unnatural. We need to make squares, and that's why whenever they build a little bridge for geckos in Arizona, I get very excited. Animals don't work that way, rivers don't work that way. You can't make everything into squares, but we need to categorize as a people. It's very uncomfortable for us when people defy categorization. You know what I'm saying? This is, a lot of these fights are just because it's uncomfortable. You know what I'm saying? This idea, you see, it's so beautiful to me. In my lifetime, I just got married. I was so proud as a New Yorker that form is like spouse and spouse now, that every citizen should have an equal right to be an equal citizen. But a lot of, you see that people can't have had such a problem with it if it can move so easily. It's simply adjusting the brain to new categories is very, very difficult. But on the Jewish right or front, what I understood is I don't care about it from the outside. Put me on whatever shelf you want. You can put on, fiction, literature, Jews, Hanukkah, sensual massage, put the book wherever you want it. But for me, I understood I was being asked to see myself as a qualified state of being. And that a Jew, that I'm supposed to, someone's going to walk in, I'm supposed to say, a Jewish man walks into the room. That's the natural state of being. I'm supposed to say a Christian man walks into the room. To ask that people expect an African-American writer to say a black man walks into the room is a ridiculous notion that one is supposed to qualify oneself as somehow other. And I understood that this was my resistance, not to the work, not to the subject matter. I learned that with the Argentina novel, the second book. After this identity was placed upon me, I really was going to write sort of like a Judenrein book. I was going to have a Jew-free novel. And I was writing for a year, and then Jews, they came up the sink, they came in the window, they would UPS, they'd knock on the door, and then there'd be a yarmulke, But this idea where I understood, this is not, that people can call it my subject matter. I don't care about Jewish subject matter at all. I write questions, I'm interested in morality and justice and vengeance and history and how we remember. These are my things. The fact that people are Jews, that's fine if you want to get hung up on that. But that's when I started to notice that is no one calls John Updike a Christian American writer. But yet, there was the big, wonderful article on Philip Roth yesterday in the newspaper, but this idea, he's turning 80, Toni Morrison's probably 83 or 84 now, our two, not even arguably, our two most legendary living writers in America, and she's an African-American writer and he's a Jewish American writer, what do they have to do, to just be American writers? And again, obviously, I recognize the subject matter, but I'm talking about this internal process of the ownership of one's identity. And once I understood that whatever comes from the outside and it can frustrate people or confuse people, I just translate the questions in my head now, and I became comfortable with it, because when people ask me about my Jewish background in writing, the question I hear asked is simply, how has living in the world sparked your imagination? That's what I really hear. They're just asking it specifically about, but it's literally just, how has being you, filled your head with ideas? I generalized it. But then there's what isn't interesting, what is subject matter to me is something like the Holocaust. And I wrote in the first book, which was already mentioned, but I wrote a story called The Tumblers, which to me was, again, not a story about the Holocaust, but about how we remember. It's set in the storied, the traditional Jewish stories of Chelm, the wise men of Chelm, but I thought the Holocaust is so pervasive that it would have invaded even this place. And it's a story about memory, and I lived with it for years. I compulsively redraft, and I'd written that story so many times forward, I actually wrote it backwards in the end. I would write a page and then write the page before. It was the only way to see it anew. My point is, I had addressed this subject. And there I was, my mind kept going to it, but I felt resistant. There's so much talk, people aren't there enough books about the Holocaust? Isn't enough been written? And it ends up being its own kind of genre in the way of Holocaust literature, most of which I don't connect with. And I, in a sense, that is back to wanting to get to that free state, getting to the work. For me, the Jewish thing, not a question, but that specific subject matter, I thought, hasn't it been written about enough? Only because so many people say, hasn't it been written about enough? But who are the people asking the question? But the point is, there I was, this is 2009, and I was living in Berlin for a few months at the American Academy, and there I was in this sitting at a table. The play I mentioned, I had just finished, I was just working on the draft of the play, deep into it, and I'd been working on a Haggadah translation for years that I just finished a draft of. I was, in this state, and I was sitting in this beautiful library, in this beautiful building, looking out at Lake Wannsee, and I suddenly saw that the whole history, here I was, these ideas kept coming back to me, but I felt like, in that way, you've touched on that idea, or that idea has been touched on, and in a sense, I was becoming uncomfortable with my own brain. Just this feeling that it's time to move on, or not to touch this idea again, or again, all these ideas, that people just keep, raising questions about a certain, line of thought. And then I was sitting in this house, and I thought suddenly that I recognized where I was, that I was living the whole history of Germany right then. I had the good fortune, because of living in this house, that I was currently literally living all of modern, Berlin and German history at one table, because this house was built, it's on Lake Wannsee in Berlin, and it was built by Hans Arnhold, by a Jewish banker of great wealth. He built himself this gorgeous mansion, and then when things got bad, you know where this story is going, but he was lucky enough to survive and get out of the country, and his house was taken over by, I think, the SS Minister of Finance, but a very high SS officer. And this is the idea, by the way, which sort of fiction is best for, because this idea is we like to make things black and white. We like to say Nazis evil, but evil does not mean without aesthetic taste. You understand, this idea, they took the most beautiful homes, elegant taste. But this idea that I was in a home that was a Jewish-built home, and then it was the SS Minister of Finance, or this high SS officer's home, and then after the war, it became the officers' club for the, occupying American force, and then when the wall came down, it became the very symbol of of the fall of the Iron Curtain and the meeting of the East and West. It became, this place of shared ideas, and I thought, suddenly all of us in this house were either, Jews, or too far left or too far right, or of color or gay. Basically everybody in that house would have been murdered for themselves or their ideas or their lineage. And I felt like this is really the beautiful thing of the way history moves. But the lake that I'm looking at having this positive thought about is Lake Wannsee, where in a house across the lake from ours, an utterly stunning house, and of all the, like a good Jewish traveler, I've been to an enormous number of Holocaust museums around the world. My punch card is near full. But I think the most moving Holocaust museum to me is the Wannsee Conference House, which is on Lake Wannsee, which is where the final solution was, literally with Eichmann as secretary, where the final solution was put into play, on this pristine, gorgeous lake, in the house, looking across ours from the lake, in this lovely front room, with the white wrought iron. I wouldn't set it up differently. And that, to me, really made me understand evil. This idea, it is the exact place you'd want to sit and have your meeting, with those glass top, white wrought iron furniture overlooking. It's the perfect place to take lunch and coffee and put the final solution into play. And to me, I thought about that, these spaces, looking at this lake, and I do feel bad, this is where, so they had the Wannsee conference at that house, and I do always feel bad for the American Academy, because they can never have a conference. They have to say, please join us for the meeting of people to chat on Lake Wannsee. Anyway, but nonetheless, I'm looking at this lake and thinking, can a lake be evil? You know what I'm saying? This idea where we put these things, this is not where evil was born. That's the point. And I thought about this living history, and as a Jewish kid from Long Island, a religious kid, one amazing thing also about that time in Berlin was the only people, it's a long time ago, we forget a lot of things in this world, a lot of horrible things happen and we move on. The idea, we're gonna, 80, we're going to get to a century soon. The idea that these many, many decades after the Holocaust, that my young, hip, artsy, really cool, Berlin friends that they were the only other people I'd met who had the same interaction, knowledge, engagement with the memory of the Holocaust that I did. I thought, you know what, this is really moving. You know what I'm saying? However you want to see history, these are innocents. You know what I'm saying? These are people not involved. These are generations later. And that idea is like literally only like the Orthodox kid I know did they engage with those ideas. So it was we were having very wonderful conversations about it, intense conversations about it. And I started to think of it about this living idea, like why am I so, why is it built now that I'm supposed to think that this is a strange idea to go back to, or that I've already written one story, or that this can't be the only idea, that I engage with for the rest of my life? What if I only want to think about the Holocaust as historical action, as issue for morality, for memory, for ideas of notions of violence and evil and goodness? And I thought, literally think it through, like why not engage with this? Like what would make it moot? Like I thought about this: when does history stop? When does it no longer matter? You know what I'm saying? When is a historical subject dead? And I think about it now. I don't think probably any country goes to war without thinking of like Napoleon's three-panga. You know what I'm saying? Like the generals, they still use these ancient battle plans. There's a reason. I felt like history no longer matters. This is what I thought of at that table. It no longer matters when it no longer informs the future. And that became very clear to me, because I think about it, you know what I'm saying? Bibi Netanyahu, who I agree with, not in the past, not in the present, almost never, and his father, who I don't agree with at all, but was a very brilliant historian. But this man who grew up with a brilliant historian father, who grew up in that house, I thought the decisions that get made, that are getting made right now, literally, are getting made because of his ideas of the Holocaust, of what it meant that, American Jews had to ask, Roosevelt to bomb the tracks, and he didn't, what it is for Jews not to have power, what it is for Jews to receive violence toward them. It is literally personal, psychological, Oedipal, historical ideas of that time. You know what I'm saying? Like World War III potentially is being defined right now. You know what I'm saying? If that whole region goes, it's all going. It's being defined by one singular man with it, you know what I'm saying? Or his, advisors of how we perceive what happened years ago. I finally understood that if this is what I want to explore forever, it is infinite in its willingness to be explored. Now, I'd been giving a talk in Rome, a few months before with the Israeli writer Edgar Keret, and a friend was there, and we were up on her roof in Rome after the talk and talking well into the night. And Edgar Keret told a really, moving family story of his, and it, very touching. I listened to such, and in the cab back to the hotel after where we were staying, I wanted to address. It was a beautiful story, but it also had a beautiful narrative to it. But it's sort of like if somebody told you, "Oh, our house just burned down," and you said that would make a great movie. You know what I'm saying? That is not the appropriate response when someone shares, personal family trauma with you. So he just told this story, and the story that started this book for me was born because Israelis don't understand when you're trying to be polite. It was a total confusion. But I said to him in Hebrew, like I wanted to say, can I engage? What I want to say is like, can I engage with this story as story? That is, you told this beautiful story, and I respect that, and have already respected it. But as two writer friends who talk about work, can I talk about? May I address the narrative elements? But it's close enough of a sentence structure that he said, kach, take it, it's yours. And that's a really beautiful thing. Like he gifted me a family story, and it's also lovely because he writes wonderful, beautiful, fantastic stories about, a guy with wings who's not an angel and a wife who turns into a fat soccer fan at midnight, it's just, talking fish, they're very, he's never going to write a story like that, and he gifted it to me, and it was very beautiful, and his father, who actually just passed away a few months ago, it's lovely, got to read the story, and his father was happy that it was in the world, and of course it's been deeply fictionalized and changed in a different number way. It's the heart of story that moves, but it was sitting at that table, looking out at this lake, thinking those thoughts, that I finally became comfortable with this idea where if this is the notion that I want to look at, then that is fine if I spend the whole rest of my life, if everything is imbued with my question about this genocide, like that is fine. So I started writing that story, which is called Free Fruit for Young Widows. But and as the story takes shape, a book, you better not be, I'm such a believer, and thank all of you for coming out for a talk that is about short stories, but I'm such a believer in the short story. I think a collection, just like a satisfying novel, where a novel is a universe and the chapters are worlds. The same with a collection of short story. A writer better not just pile up the stories he or she has on his or her desk and publish them in a collection. Like, there needs to be, in that same way, an arc. It needs to be, you know what I'm saying? You just can't take Mars and put it over here like, they have to go, there has to be an order to your universe, to your cosmos. So as this, at some point, back to this idea of consciousness, it starts to take shape to me, and I start to see, and I see the shape of this, and I started, again, feeling comfortable, first with the ownership of this idea, and then with the ownership of self, in a way. You know what I'm saying? I had been working the last 3 years. There I was, working as a playwright for all these years. Like tonight, I stand here before you a playwright because I have a play up. But, that's how it works. But this idea, I had been working as hard as I could on things that for which I did not have any reference points to, by which I did not identify that I did not want to be. And that really freed up my mind. I was working as a translator without, I'm not a translator, but if I'm translating, I must be. I'm not a playwright. If I'm playwriting, I must be. This is, again, what I was saying to the students. When you're swimming, you're a swimmer. When you're dreaming, you're a dreamer. This is it. So this idea of taking ownership of both the idea and of the craft itself, I suddenly was able, in a sense, to feel a different intimacy in a different way than I felt before. Because up to this point, there's a reason I don't write memoir or nonfiction, because if I started to tell you a family secret right now, my mom would burst out from behind there and I would be literally there would be an ice pick through my heart before I even got a sentence out. We do not share family stories in my house like that. Just not done. And for me, I used to call myself shy, but that doesn't work anymore, so I'll call myself a private person. I'm a private person, and for me, the idea of a shared consciousness, literally to hold, I'm saying that for those of you who have read the book, that to me is, the deepest kind of connection. It's beautiful. It's an erasure. It literally is a metaphysical thing happening. It is a shared consciousness. When you feel like you know a writer, sometimes if friends see someone come up to me and they feel like they know me from reading the book, like they do. That's fair and that's real. That is like a shared mind. But for me, it only works if I'm honest with you. And this goes back to Holocaust as idea and ideas of good and evil. It doesn't work. Writers are a terrible bunch. Don't lend us money. Don't ask us to babysit or pick you up, or at the airport, we'll leave you waiting. You know what I'm saying? Where you can be terrible and messed up and really deviant in your regular life in a million different ways. But when one is writing, one has to have it's a system of weights and measures. It has to be pitch perfect. Because if I tell you right now it's day out and it's night, we can't communicate. If I tell you a character is good and you think they're evil, we can't communicate. It begs for true and real intimacy. Well, up until now in life, I really felt that distance allowed for the erasure of distance. So that idea, the story that is now my play, The 27th Man, which is people talk to me, it's 4 writers, being executed under Stalin in 1952, and people talk to me about communism and Stalinism and socialism and Itzhak Pfeffer and Markish and Yiddish writers and all these things for which the story, much like the Jewish thing, is not about. For me, it was the decision to write. But for me to have that intimacy, I had to go to Stalinist prison in 1952 to raise that question. Or maybe the better example is, watching what was happening, living my life in Jerusalem. For me to write Jerusalem in 1996, I spent 10 years in Argentina in 1976. It's that distance that allows for the intimacy. But something about starting to own my own identity, starting to feel comfortable with these ideas, allowed me for the first time to take a half step back in my own life. And one thing that I thought about, which became the title story of this book, was a game we used to play in my house, which is not a game at all, but to save time, I'll call it a game. What it really is engaging with a sort of twisted pathology. But it's a game my sister invented, and it's the Anne Frank game, or the Who Will Hide Us game, or the Righteous Gentile game. But we grew up wondering which of our Gentile neighbors would hide us in the event of a Holocaust. And I just never, everything is normality, whatever your life is. If you grew up a lobster fisherman, then that's, they get up at 5 or 4 or 3, whatever they do, and you get the traps. Like, that would be a very odd thing. To me, that's foreign. It's not foreign if your dad's got or mom's got the lobster boat. But this idea, this is just how we saw the world. This is how we categorize. It's both a game and not a game, because it was dead serious. And I just never really thought about it as anything but what people do. But then when we were about, just on the edge of adulthood, my sister had said about a couple we know, she said, he would hide us and she would turn us in. And I thought about it, and it stayed with me. It stayed with me for 20 years because you know what? He would totally hide us, and then he'd go to work, and she would turn us in. It's totally a good judgment call. We're not going to that house. You know what I'm saying? But I just had never thought about, at that table in that moment, as I work on the stories, I'm thinking, that is really deeply loaded and deeply twisted and also deeply right. And this is the point of why, why I write fiction. Because there's mathematics and, and politics and, there's all kinds of things that are, there are exacting sciences or things where you have to freeze your position. But I'm not a person who likes to take those stands. I really will always listen to the other side. If you tell me my name's not Nathan right now, I'm literally not going to say, yes, it is. I'm going to think, maybe I'm so tired and I said the wrong name. Maybe that's not my name and you have information that I don't have. Maybe I'm having a mini stroke. There could be any number of possibilities. I'm always willing. And what fiction allows is for the exploration of questions. And I thought about this question, why that's the title story of the book and why, why it's the title of that story, why that's the title story of the book, and why this single moment, is really the thread that runs through the whole of the collection, was because I thought about this idea of who will hide me, of what it means. Because you know what, and it's very sweet, there was in British, right? It was a very lovely review, and the one issue with the book, it was really, very generous. The one issue with the book that the critic took was he said, it's absurd, the idea of Jews in 2012 in America, in Florida, that they would ever, worry about a second Holocaust. And to me, it was so touchingly British. I'm like, it's like he never met a Jewish person. All we talk about is Holocaust and food. That's it. 2 subjects, But I really thought about this notion because he's also right. And that's why I like this as a question for a story and as a question to ponder over maybe till the day I die. Because if you think about this it is absurd for Jews to ever consider, for us to be raised as children, to be fearing a second Holocaust. And you know what, as adults, I can tell you, my sister, and she will admit it, it won't embarrass her for me to say, she can tell you where she'd put drywall in her house to make a hidden. We always think this way. Not a joke, seriously. And I have to say, having traveled this book around the world, I see this game is played not just by Jews, but across cultures with their own, people play the, Underground Railroad, people play this version with whatever their trauma that they connect with, their, social, religious, cultural trauma. But the point is, so yes, it is utterly ridiculous for a Jew to think about a second Holocaust in this time. This is the best time, not arguably the best time for Jews in America. It's the best time for Jews in all of history. The most vibrant, the most public, the most supportive, the safest. It's like moving to me in New York. I was having dinner on Rosh Hashanah. I don't think I was paying attention that it was Rosh Hashanah. And a friend who's the waspiest guy ever met walks in. He's like, "Happy Rosh Hashanah, buddy." I was like, "That's right. It's part of culture." Someone just said, Robert De Niro said Michigas in the New York Times Magazine on Sunday, and I was overjoyed. That's right. De Niro's like, it's Michigas for that guy. Anyway, but the point is, right, this is the most glorious time in all of history for Jews that Jews should never feel safer. So it's a ludicrous notion to want to be made to feel unsafe in this country. And then I also think, if we look at history, how did every single glorious time for Jews end? In the golden age of Spain, in Berlin, in the Jews of Arab lands. Literally, if you think also that the very opposite, which is, that the brain can hold both these things at the same time, that this is the complexity of how we live, where an idea can be utterly ludicrous, utterly untenable, and also the only way to think, but a sort of poisonous way to think. And it was, I think, the moment that I engaged with that notion, holding those both things in my head, splitting them up into characters, sharing and exploring that idea, that the book for me really took shape. I probably am right on the clock for you guys. Maybe I'll take a question or two, even though I have 9,000 more pages. Thank you.
It struck me listening to you talk about your conflict between being an American writer and a Jewish writer and an American Jewish writer. That conflict is the conflict between American identity and whatever other identities you carry is the very core of American strength. And it occurs to me that as long as you maintain that sort of conflict between your being an American writer and a Jewish writer, that would tend to guarantee that over the long run you will maintain the creativity because you are both, and that makes you better at being both. And I'm wondering, Do you get that sense of how you build on that conflict when you think about your career over the long period?
Well, I mean, thank you for circling it all around, because this is essentially how I talk. Like, I'll take that as a blessing. But, when you ask that, I just see then, when you state it that way, I can see sort of the path of, and that's it. I can both, in a lateral sense, in a current sense, say, I write about the things that concern me, and I don't, who cares if they're Jews? That's not my concern. That can be other people's point of interest or disinterest. But if I look across time and history, it's almost what you're raising is the history of Jews writing in America. It's not an accident that, like, a person whose first language was, if you look at, Bellow, and if you look at Malamud, that a Jew wrote The Natural, like the ultimate baseball book. This idea of Roth, those guys, it's, my dad's Brooklyn generation. It's this notion that Jews were still fighting to be American. As I said, that, like, the next generation's going to ask about this time, like, really? Like, gay people couldn't get married? We're living that now. But my parents, I still can't believe when my mother said, like, oh, your father applied, he got a job, but it was a white shoe firm. They didn't hire Jews. The idea that, like, somebody in New York wasn't hiring Jews, when I was, is like a shocking notion to me. But those guys, the goal was to become American, those writers. That was to date Monkey, like to date the blonde-haired girl, to become American, to be accepted, to be able to be Jewish and to be American. But I think there was such great success with that generation, such really wonderful, again, the true testament to this nation, such wonderful acceptance and success that then it allowed for a refracted thing, which is then my parents' generation got to build a shtetl. You know what I'm saying? That was literally, they were so comfortable as Americans, they were then able to be Jews again. And I think that's maybe what leaves, my generation in this split place on that line. But in terms of my consciousness, it's exactly what you're raising is what I better never ever think about, not for a second. That is an outside thing for you to think in. For me, exactly that. I want to know what happens if I write the whole history of the settlements in one story. What happens if two couples who disagree about the very nature of the Holocaust end up getting high together? You know what I'm saying? That has to be my concern, not any of those structural things. But I appreciate I hear you. Uno más? Yes, sir.
How do you feel about the idea that America is good for Jews and bad for Judaism?
That's funny, is how I feel about that. You know what, I don't, I actually put, see, this is the idea of, I just want everything in its right size when people make certain comments. I mean, that's the line that I give to a character in my story, which is, I remember, and maybe it was only one rabbi once, or maybe it wasn't a rabbi, but someone saying in my childhood, intermarriage is a second Holocaust. And I was like, people falling in love across cultures is beautiful in Romeo and Juliet. You don't have to approve of it. You can worry about the dissipation of your culture, but it's really different than putting people in ovens. You know what I'm saying? So this idea of, like, if a culture, you know what I am? I'm a cultural Darwinian across all fronts. You know what I'm saying? So if a culture is not strong enough to live, then it should disappear. Like this idea of the worry, the idea of living things in fear, you can address things, but you need to live them in a vibrant, active way. I feel the same way about the book. You know what I'm saying? It's my lifetime where it's turning digital. Is the book going to die? Is the novel going to die? Like, if it's going to die, let it. I so believe in it, and that's why I so believe in the strength of culture. Like, you can't fight, you know what I'm saying? To me, it's terrifying. So this is the point. I always say, like, if you're worried about the story, like the photograph didn't kill the painting, the movie didn't kill the photograph, the talkie killed the silent film, except someone made an awesome one last year and it won 8 Oscars. You know what I'm saying? If you make something, if something is living and vibrant, you never need to worry about it. But yes, these things come to, my wife's getting a PhD or 2 at Madison, and we're out there a lot, and I just read, someone's telling me about, like, one of the Native American tribes where, like, to me, that's literally the limits of that horror of what, again, what genocide and this kind of treatment of cultures can do, where someone had given a grant maybe of like $100,000 that there's 7 people left who speak this language, like what it is to try and send someone in to find 7 old people. And to me that's like almost dizzy. There's something I wrestle with in my head. Do you say that? What does it mean to have gotten that far? But my point is, this is a beautiful country, and like live culture the way you want, but this it can't be imposed. It can only be lived. So that's the point. Having been raised that way, I'm in the quandary is how do I raise my kids to be really able to read a daf of Gemara and speak fluent Hebrew, but also be really anti-organized religion? I'm not sure what school, the Yiddish Gemara school of atheists, it's very hard to find your specific continuum.